For over 2,000 years, Petra has stood as Jordan's crown jewel, a rose-red city carved into rock, admired by millions and protected as one of the world's greatest treasures.
What if one of the most famous monuments on Earth has been hiding a secret right under our feet for more than 2,000 years? Millions of people visit Petra's treasury every year. They take photos, admire the incredible carvings, and move on. But recently, archaeologists made a discovery beneath this ancient structure that could completely rewrite its history. Hidden tombs, human skeletons, and evidence suggesting the building may be far more than just a beautiful facade. So the question is, what was the treasury actually built for? And why are scientists only now beginning to uncover the truth? Before we even get to the famous treasury, we need to talk about the people who built it, because honestly, the Nabateans might be one of the most underrated civilizations in human history. And that's not an exaggeration. These guys didn't start out as kings or empire builders. They were originally nomadic Arab tribes, desert travelers moving from place to place with their herds, trading goods across the Arabian Peninsula. For a long time, they left almost no permanent trace behind. If you lived back then, you probably would have just seen them passing through with a caravan and thought, all right, travelers. But somewhere around the 4th century BC, they made a decision that would completely change their future. Instead of wandering the desert forever, they found a hidden valley deep in the mountains of what is now southern Jordan. And when I say hidden, I mean really hidden, surrounded by massive cliffs and practically invisible from the outside world. Most people wouldn't even know it was there. But the Nabateans looked at that secret valley and thought, this is home. And instead of just building a normal city, they decided to do something far more ambitious. They carved an entire capital straight into the rock. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Petra wasn't just a cool-looking city. It was located at the perfect spot on the ancient world's trade network. Imagine the busiest highway intersection on Earth, but for camel caravans. Trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, the Mediterranean, and even parts of the Far East all passed through this valley. And those caravans weren't carrying cheap stuff either. We're talking frankincense, myrrh, silk, spices, gold, luxury goods that were insanely valuable at the time. And every single caravan that wanted to pass through Nabatean land had to pay a little fee, or in simpler terms, a tax. One caravan pays? Fine. But thousands of caravans over decades? That's a money machine. By their peak, the Nabateans had quietly become one of the wealthiest civilizations on the planet, and they did it by basically controlling the ancient world's version of global shipping routes. Their capital city, Petra, eventually grew to hold tens of thousands of people, which is wild when you remember this place sits in the middle of a desert. But the Nabateans weren't just traders, they were engineering geniuses. They built incredibly advanced water systems that could capture and store rainwater in a place where rain barely shows up. Think about that. In one of the driest regions on Earth, they figured out how to collect and save every single drop. On top of that, they had paved roads, beautifully painted pottery, and their own written script, a script that historians believe later helped influence modern Arabic writing. Their architecture was also something totally unique. Instead of copying just one culture, they blended ideas from Greek, Egyptian, and Arabian styles, creating buildings that looked unlike anything else in the ancient world. And right at the entrance of this incredible city, at the exact point where the narrow canyon finally opens up, stood the structure that would become Petra's most famous symbol, the monument that still leaves people speechless today, the treasury. Carved directly into a towering cliff face, it stands about 40 meters tall and 25 meters wide, making it one of the most impressive rock-cut facades ever created by human hands. Historians believe it took roughly 3 years of non-stop carving to complete. And here's the crazy part. While most of Petra has slowly worn down by 2,000 years of wind, floods, and desert storms, the treasury survived in almost unbelievable condition. The narrow gorge around it basically acted like nature's protective shield. But after the Nabatean kingdom was eventually absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 AD, Petra slowly began to fade away. Trade routes changed, people moved elsewhere, and over time, the once bustling city was gradually abandoned, buried under sand and debris, and almost completely forgotten by the outside world. For centuries, Petra existed more like a legend than a real place. Then, in 1812, something incredible happened. A Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt disguised himself as a Muslim pilgrim because foreigners weren't easily allowed into the region at the time, and managed to talk his way into the hidden valley. When he finally walked through the narrow canyon and saw the treasury standing there in the rock, he was completely stunned. He reportedly didn't even have the words to properly describe it. Once news reached Europe, the reaction was immediate. Explorers, painters, historians, and eventually archaeologists started pouring into Petra, all eager to see this mysterious place for themselves. And almost every single one of them ended up asking the exact same question: what on earth is this building actually for? Now here's a fun fact most tourists standing in front of Petra never realize. The name, the Treasury, is actually completely made up. Yep, the Nabateans never called it that. The name Al-Khazneh, which literally means the treasury, came much later from the Bedouin tribes who lived around the ruins for centuries after Petra was abandoned. And the reason they chose that name? Well, they had a pretty wild theory. According to local legend, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh had hidden an enormous fortune inside a giant stone urn sitting near the top of the building's facade. People believed it so strongly that Bedouin tribesmen actually started shooting at it with rifles, hoping the urn would crack open and rain treasure down like some ancient desert piñata. And believe it or not, you can still see the bullet holes today. Of course, there was just one tiny problem with that plan. The urn isn't hollow. It's carved from a single solid piece of sandstone. So no matter how many times people fired at it, nothing ever happened. No gold coins, no jewels, not even a dramatic crack. Just a very stubborn rock sitting there like, nice try. But the legend didn't stop there. Another version of the story tied the building to the time of Moses, claiming it was the Khazneh el-Pharaon, or treasury of the pharaoh. According to this tale, a magical pharaoh supposedly hid his riches here while chasing the Israelites through the desert. Historical accuracy? Questionable. Great story? Absolutely. And these stories were so popular that they shaped how people thought about the building for generations, even among early scholars who really should have known better. But when archaeologists finally managed to study the inside of the treasury, things got confusing because the interior didn't match the grand, mysterious exterior at all. In fact, it was almost shockingly plain. Inside, there's basically a large central hall and 3 small side chambers. The walls are smooth, there are almost no decorations, no colorful paintings, no dramatic inscriptions, no hidden treasure rooms, and worst of all for treasure hunters, no treasure. So archaeologists looked at the evidence and came up with what seemed like the most logical explanation. The treasury, they said, must have been a royal tomb, specifically a tomb built for King Aratus IV, the most powerful ruler the Nabateans ever had. He ruled from 9 BC to 40 AD during the absolute golden age of Petra. The size of the monument, its position at the entrance of the city, and the religious symbols carved on the facade all seem to point towards a grand burial monument for a king. For most of the 20th century, that explanation made perfect sense. It was neat, logical, and widely accepted. But as it turns out, the story of the treasury wasn't quite that simple, because in 2003 something happened that cracked that tidy explanation wide open. Not because archaeologists suddenly had a brilliant idea, but because of a global event no one saw coming. When the Iraq War began, tourism across the Middle East collapsed almost overnight. Petra, which is usually packed with thousands of visitors every day, suddenly became quiet, almost eerily quiet. And for archaeologists, that silence created a rare opportunity. For the first time in years, the huge plaza in front of the famous facade was finally not crowded with tourists taking selfies. It was finally open enough for serious excavation. So a Jordanian archaeologist named Suleiman Farajat assembled a team and started digging right in the forecourt, the open space directly in front of the famous facade. Their goals seemed simple: find construction clues that could finally tell historians exactly when the treasury was built. But almost immediately, the dig revealed something strange. The ground everyone had been walking on for decades wasn't the original ground at all. Over centuries, powerful desert flash floods had slowly buried the original forecourt under layers of sand, mud, and debris. The real plaza, the one the Nabateans actually used, was sitting about 6 meters below the modern surface. That's roughly the height of a 2-story building. Once the archaeologists dug down to that level,
the discoveries started getting a lot more interesting. Beneath the buried sediment, they uncovered 3 rock-cut burial chambers, ancient tombs that had been completely hidden for centuries. Inside those tombs, archaeologists found pottery fragments that could be scientifically dated, and the results placed them somewhere between 25 and 10 BC.
Now here's where things get really intriguing. The tops of those older tombs had been cut away and partially destroyed, which means when the Nabateans built the treasury, those tombs were already there, and the builders deliberately carved them down to make space for the massive structure above. In other words, the treasury had to come after those tombs. That discovery placed its construction firmly in the later years of King Aretas IV's reign, probably somewhere between 18 and 40 AD. That alone was a big breakthrough, but the tombs themselves weren't actually the most interesting part of the discovery. What really caught the archaeologists' attention was everything around them. In the surrounding soil, they started finding incense burners, fragments of altars, and traces of burnt offerings, which suggested that the forecourt wasn't just a random open space people walked through on the way into the city. It looked much more like a sacred ritual area, a place where ceremonies, offerings, and religious activities were happening regularly. So now the treasury wasn't just a mysterious monument, it was sitting at the center of what appeared to be a ceremonial complex. That changed the way researchers began thinking about the entire site. Unfortunately, the excavation didn't last as long as the team hoped. Jordanian authorities eventually decided to backfill the dig to protect the exposed structures from weather damage. The work ended earlier than planned, leaving many questions unanswered. But the researchers walked away with a strong feeling that they had only scratched the surface. And a few years later, new technology seemed to confirm that suspicion. When scientists scanned the area with ground-penetrating radar, the machines detected something odd beneath the other side of the forecourt. Signals suggesting underground spaces, hollow areas where solid rock should have been. Basically, something was hiding under there. The problem? No one knew what it was, and for more than 20 years, nobody went down there to find out. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because the discovery in 2024 didn't just add a tiny detail to the history of the treasury, it basically forced historians to step back and rethink the entire purpose of the building from scratch. For years, experts believed they had the answer. Nice, clean, simple. It's a royal tomb. Case closed. And that contrast isn't a design flaw, it's actually the whole point. The inside was meant for the dead, quiet, simple, sacred. But the outside, though, that was meant for the living. The audience for all that breathtaking carving wasn't the people buried inside. It was every traveler, merchant, pilgrim, or visitor who walked through the narrow Sikh canyon and suddenly saw this massive monument appear in front of them. And honestly, that reaction still happens today, because more than 2,000 years later, people still walk out of that canyon, see the treasury for the first time, and stop in their tracks, exactly the way the Nabateans intended. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible discovery.